Okay, well, warm welcome, everyone. I mean, I'm really delighted to have three senior politicians with us this afternoon, three ministers in the Welsh Government, to talk to us about some of the progress that's been made around the LGBT plus agenda in Wales. Very important one, of course, for a Welsh Government that is committed to equality for all of its citizens. So I feel very privileged to be able to chair this panel. I'm going to introduce our colleagues one by one and ask them to just say a few words about their portfolio and the work that they've done around LGBT rights. So I'll start with Kirsty Williams. Kirsty Williams, member of the Senedd, is Minister for Education and has been since 2016. She's also been a member of the Senedd, or the Assembly as was, since the very beginning in 1999. She's a former leader of the Welsh Liberal Democrats and is a driving force behind some of the changes that we've seen in education around reforms to the curriculum, including the new plans for compulsory relationship and sexuality education for all children in Welsh schools. Kirsty, would you mind telling us a little bit about those plans and how you see them rolling out?
Of course, and thank you so much for the invitation to be with everybody this afternoon. On coming into office, I was determined to look at our curriculum in Wales and ensure that what is taught in our schools not only prepares our citizens for the world of work, but also ensures that they can play a full and active part in civic life, and also that they have the skills to equip them to be happy and healthy individuals. And we all know that our relationships of whatever kind are fundamental to that health and happiness. We also listen to feedback from children and young people on the current state of play of what is currently taught in our schools around sex education, as it's called. And the overwhelming feedback from children and young people was that it's not adequate. What we were currently doing was not meeting their needs. And it was not meeting the needs of all of our young people, but it was specifically not meeting the needs of young people in the LGBT community. And so we really wanted to get to grips about how we could ensure that all of our children's needs were met. And we set up a group under the chairmanship of Professor Emma Reynolds at Cardiff University to look at the current state of play. And we thought that perhaps part of the problem was about material and resources. But the feedback from that expert group was very much around the fact that we needed a strong statement of intent and a legal underpinning to ensure that all children received relationship and sexuality education, that it was delivered in a pluralistic form, and it was delivered by professionals that were skilled and trained and confident to deliver really, really great lessons and great tuition. And I'm delighted that we can continue to work on those elements. But when we published our curriculum and assessment bill just before the end of the summer recess, we were able to make good on our promise that relationship and sexuality education will be a compulsory part of every child's education in Wales from the age of 3 through to the age of 16. It will be fully inclusive, and we will also ensure that all children have access to it by removing the right of withdrawal that currently exists in the system. So although under the current system, these lessons are compulsory, children's parents can withdraw them from those lessons, and that will not be allowed in the new system. So we have the twin track approach now of making sure that legislation proceeds and those principles are enshrined in law, but also preparing the profession and our communities for what those lessons mean. So we've set up an advisory group because the draft bill requires us to have a code which sets out very clearly what good RSE should include, and we're going to be consulting with a wide range of people in the development of that code, so that that teachers, students, and their families can be assured of what is included in these lessons, and sometimes to dispel some of the myths and the scaremongering about what isn't included, because sometimes those people who are opposed to this agenda, they like to perhaps tell people that, no, this is what your child is going to be taught, and try to scaremonger, and of course that's not the case. So we want to be able to give full clarity and be clear in our expectations of professionals about what a really inclusive RSE curriculum will look like for our children and young people.
Thank you, Kirsty. I mean, we'll come back to that issue of what's included and what might not be included. But tell me, first of all, do you think that the Welsh Government and yourself as Minister has done enough to reassure parents and teachers that the compulsory element will be acceptable, and that there won't be the kind of protests that we saw in some English schools in Birmingham, particularly over the way in which some aspects of relationship education was delivered?
Well, you're absolutely right. Initially, when we consulted on making sure that RSE was compulsory, there was absolute unanimous support for that principle. But then we saw what happened across the border in England, and immediately we did see a reaction to that here in Wales. And it certainly has created some tension. So we've been working, and my colleague Jane has been instrumental in doing this as well. We've been working with a variety of community groups to involve them in this process, and to be able to provide that assurance around why these lessons are so important to a child's healthy development, and why these lessons are crucial to achieving some of the goals of our curriculum. It's a purpose-led curriculum, and I don't believe we can deliver on the purposes of our curriculum if we don't have fully inclusive compulsory RSE lessons. And we will continue to work with those groups to be able to listen and to understand any worries that they may have, and to be able to provide that reassurance. And we're working across government to deliver that work.
Okay, thank you. Let's deal with one specific aspect, which a lot of our colleagues have raised, which is the issue of transgender rights and the way in which that's fairly covered in the curriculum, or the plans for the curriculum. We know that a number of local authorities have had reservations and have been lobbied around that aspect of RSE. Yet it seems to me that the guidance that's been given to local authorities is all endorsed by the Welsh Government in the Transgender Action Plan. So how do you reassure the trans community that their rights and their profile and so on will be fairly and accurately and equitably represented in the new curriculum and RSE?
It's absolutely crucial. We can't achieve what we want by only achieving it for some members of our community. This has to be a commitment to deliver fully inclusive RSE. I'm aware of situations such as the one we've seen in Wrexham, where we're going to have to work with our local authorities to support them in ensuring that what they're able to do is in line with the aspirations of the Welsh Government. We are funding some third sector organisations to specifically help us with this work, recognising that within the government itself we don't have all of the answers or indeed the expertise. And so we're working with our partners, in this case with Stonewall, to look at some very specific resources and specific interventions to make sure that those understandable concerns and fears and worries from the trans community aren't realised, and that we don't make the mistakes of the past, and we don't inadvertently fall into a situation where there are some aspects of relationships and sexuality that we don't want to talk about, or we won't allow teachers to talk about. And we can't make the mistakes of the past, can we? And that's why we're working with outside groups with expertise to ensure that they're holding up our feet to the fire, my feet to the fire, but we're also making sure that what we develop and what we're able to deliver is what young people will need and what they want.
Okay, diolch yn fawr, Kirsty. Can we move on to Jane Hutt now? Jane is a member of the Senedd and, like Kirsty, was elected in the original Assembly back in 1999. I think you've held a lot of different ministerial positions in that time, Jane, but you're currently obviously leading on the equality brief as Deputy Minister. Can you tell us a little bit about your recent statement of support for the trans community? Because we all read that. Obviously, Jeremy Miles and yourself criticised some of the UK government's approach to Gender Recognition Act reform. Tell us what the Welsh Government's plans are to ensure that your statements on gender recognition and trans rights are properly respected.
Thank you very much, Lauren. I mean, I have to just say that it's been really great to be back in this role as leading on equalities, because in a sense, equalities drove me into politics. And I've had this role more than once over the last 21 years. But I think, the situation we're in now, I mean, there's a huge threat because of the UK government's failure in terms of the Gender Recognition Act consultation. We've been pressing over the last year when we're going to have the publication of the review, huge consultation responses. So when we heard, and obviously we haven't had the full review response yet from the UK government, but we heard what was likely to come out of it. We met with Stonewall Cymru and members of the trans communities in Wales. That was back in early July. And it was very important to listen and learn from the members of the trans community about their concerns about lack of progress by UK government. It did have formally a commitment to the Gender Recognition Act reforms. And so, we wanted to express our concerns and our deep disappointment in a statement that we subsequently issued after that meeting. And I think the issue for us now is, of course, we haven't got all the powers to be able to deal with some of the concerns that have come through, but it's what we can actually do in Wales to support the trans community. And that's sort of laid out in the statement. We are actually, obviously, as well as raising our concerns with the UK government, we're going to refresh the Transgender Action Plan for Wales. What's been really great over the last year or so of this role is the fact that we are actually funding Stonewall Cymru. Past times we were very supportive of Stonewall Cymru Pride, of course, as well. And can we all express our disappointment we won't be out in the streets this summer, as we've always been. Such a fantastic, not just in Cardiff, in my constituency, Lantwick Major, Barry, as well last year. But I think what we fund Stonewall Cymru. And as Kirsty has said, this means that they get a quality inclusion grant, and they're now actually going to work through with us consultation, engaging stakeholders, of course, to develop an updated transgender action plan for Wales. One of the issues, of course, when we met earlier on in July, and this obviously applies to LGBT plus community, is about the other issues that we are responsible for. We've talked about education, but we need to address hate crime in Wales and what we can do about hate crime, putting more money into the National Hate Crime Centre, victim support, checking, as I've just done today, every week, the statistics that are coming through about hate crime. Bullying in schools as well came up, and obviously something that Kirsty dealing with in terms of the anti-bullying policy, but also the fact the curriculum is crucial actually to changing attitudes. And this is also intersectional as well, obviously, in terms of all forms of discrimination, and we need to ensure that we recognise that in terms of trans women and trans men, and recognising that in terms of how we move forward with our transgender action plan, which has to be updated. So, and also, and I'm sure Julie James will be commenting on this, that there are other issues that are affecting people's lives across the communities, LGBT plus and trans communities, which relate to, and the lockdown has been very, very difficult. We heard about that, but it does relate to incomes, jobs, and housing. So we've got to look at what we're responsible for in Wales and learn, you know, from education to housing to actually equality and human rights, what we can do in Wales to show that Wales is there with trans people, with the LGBT plus community, and Stonewall Cymru, and of course all our partners in Pride are helping us do that.
Thank you, Jane. I mean, you rightly identify that obviously the GRA work is not devolved. It's a reserved matter. I mean, to what extent is the Welsh Government lobbying your newish UK leader to ensure that, you know, that his stance and the Labour Party at UK level are working on this issue as well? Because I'm sure that the trans community in particular would want to know more about that.
Yes, well, I think the trans community was very positive about the statement made by myself and Jeremy Miles, and of course this is two, actually I have to say, two Welsh Labour ministers and Labour-led Welsh Government making this statement. So obviously this has an impact on our colleagues in the Labour movement and our new leader. Also very supportive of what we're doing and saying. And we are focusing principally on what we in Wales, what our responsibilities are as a Welsh Government and what we can do. But, you know, I think we have, and we've demonstrated that we can show in Wales and through Welsh Labour that we can lead the way and help our colleagues understand what it is to stand up and make statements of this kind. But I mean, as you say, it is about what we can do. I've actually, just one thing I wanted to say is that I've written to the Home Secretary. Again, we're not getting very far yet, but I've urged the Home Office to recognise LGBT plus hate crime as an aggregated offence in line with race and faith hate crime. And that's important that people hear this on this broadcast. Actually, there is an ongoing review by the Law Commission of this, and they're going to finally publish their report next year. But I think we have got to make our representations to the UK government. I'm certainly going to be responding when they finally publish their response to the consultation. But also we need to show that we are using our powers to good effect here in Wales.
Sure. Okay, diolch yn fawr iawn, Jane. And last but by no means least, we're delighted to be joined by Julie James, member of the Senedd. Julie was elected in 2011 for Swansea West. She's been a Deputy Minister for Skills and Technology and also Leader of the House and Chief Whip, but her current role is as Minister for Housing and Local Government. And this is an important role for the LGBT plus community because, of course, we know that there are high instances of homelessness amongst young people from these communities who, for whatever reason, have to leave their family home. So, Julie, would you tell us a little bit about the homelessness strategy and the housing strategy more generally that might affect people in our communities?
Certainly, Laura, with great pleasure. So we, before the pandemic had hit, which now seems like decades ago, but was only a few months ago, we'd asked a housing action group who was led by John Sparks from Crisis to help us to develop a strategy by which we could eradicate homelessness in Wales. So we'd started on that journey as a result of a lot of research that we've been doing over the last couple of years into things like Housing First, which is where you give somebody a secure home straight up and then wrap services around them, which has been very successful in Canada and Scandinavian countries. And we've been doing quite a lot of piloting of those kinds of approaches. And then we just received the second report of the Homelessness Action Group when the pandemic hit. And the world shifted. And as a result of the pandemic, we were suddenly in a position where we needed to make sure that every person in our society could self-isolate and have good hygiene and so on. And you clearly can't do that if you're sleeping rough or in very temporary accommodation. So we had to put an emergency plan into place. As it happens, that emergency plan was broadly in line with what we were about to accept from the Housing Action Group's policy, but it was much accelerated. So I don't know who it was who said never waste a good crisis, but if there's one good thing that's come out of this pandemic, which has been so dreadful for so many people, but if there's one good thing, it is that we did manage to do exactly that. We managed to get people in off the streets and out of very insecure accommodation, sofa surfing and so on, into the right kind of accommodation. We know that large numbers. So the Housing Action Group's report told us something we already knew, but it confirmed it to us, which is a large number of young people who face homelessness or very insecure accommodation, where they're sleeping with, on sofas of friends and so on, are where there's family breakdown as a result of sexuality or, trans issues and so on. And so the first thing to say is that Kirsty's curriculum reforms are front and center of the strategy for this, because that happens when families just don't understand what's going on. They're not able to accept their young person's identity or, need to be themselves, and the family relationship breaks down. So if you can nip that in the bud to start off with, then we'll have a large number of, numbers of less presentations of homelessness. So we're all about prevention as well as then sorting out what happens when that has happened. So that's the first thing. It is absolutely front and center. The second thing is then working with our local authorities to recognize that and to put in place the kinds of support services that people need to establish themselves as an autonomous human being in whatever circumstances, but actually to mend relationships with families, which are so important as well. And so to work with family relationship counselling and so on in those circumstances. And then the second is that person gets into a permanent secure home that suits them and has all the services necessary to support them in that home as soon as possible. So that might be a variety of things. So the young person in question may not have any other problems, and it's enough of a problem to have broken up with your family at a young age. They may have the skills necessary to support a tenancy or whatever, but the likelihood is that they won't. They might never have lived alone before. They may never, have had to manage a budget or rent and so on. So it's about getting the skills package around them to make sure that they can sustain a tenancy where we've given it. And then, of course, many people will have had many years of problems. So they may have mental health problems, they may have substance abuse problems, they may have any amount of other difficulties. And this has been about getting the public services across Wales to come together in a person-centred package to enable that person to maintain their secure and permanent home. And Laura, these are things that sound straightforward and easy, but just aren't. It's just not easy to do that. So yesterday I went to a project in Newport run by Mind, where we're just about to fund 7 self-contained flats at the top of a building, where all the services for mental health support, family relationship support, welfare, benefit support, skills and job support, ongoing education support, all of those things are available in the building. And then people who, perhaps for the first time ever are living alone will be able to be in the flats above there while they, get their heads together, get themselves sorted out as the person they want to be, and put them in a position to be able to move out into the world. And I met a young woman there who makes you smile immediately you think of her, who's been through the most horrendous time, not my story to them like that, and is about to start to train to be a nurse. A tremendous outcome given where she started, and more power to her elbow, but the services that were wrapped around her, more power to them as well. And so what we're trying to do is duplicate that across Wales. It won't be the same everywhere. There'll be different sorts of services that people need, but what they need is easy, rapid access to them. They don't need to have to navigate 12 different hurdles to get different kinds of advice from different people, make a relationship with each one of those, endlessly repeat their story while they go through. They want a single access system. So we're putting these hubs together all over Wales. Every local authority in Wales has stepped up to this plate. It's been transformational. I mean, I just can't tell you the attitude change over the last 20 phenomenal. And one of the people in Housing Options that I've spoken to said to me that previously they felt like gatekeepers, but now she felt like a facilitator. So it was, she was able to assist the person properly to get into a home for the first time. So that's transformational. It's been amazing. So the big task for me now is to build on that, to make sure that we are able to help people who have got to the sharp end, but also to get that preventative agenda out there, to get people to understand each other and not have these kinds of problems. So it's a huge issue for the LGBT plus community because of the sorts of issues that we've just been discussing with Jane and Kirsty. But there are all kinds of other issues driven that affect everybody as well, regardless of sexuality or anything else. Relationship breakdown, family problems, right through to horrendous kind of domestic abuse situations and so on, where we need to make sure that people have the right support in the first place, take the right decisions, and then get the right service. So the last thing I wanted to say, Laura, was we've been running a big advertising campaign right through the pandemic to get people to realise when they're starting to be homeless. It's a terrible thing to think of yourself as homeless. So people tend not to. I'm staying with a friend. I'm welcome in this friendship group. It doesn't matter that I'm on the sofa. I'm not really homeless. This is a place for me. But to actually come forward early enough before that starts to break down for us to get them help. And that's been very successful. We've had a very large number of people coming through who are saying that because of that advertising that they've seen on social media, on TV and various other places, that they were able to recognise the first time that they were in that situation and come forward before they fell all the way through the system. So that's what we're after as well. So Kirsty's curriculum reforms, Jane's support groups right across Wales, and then our kind of statutory services all coming together to make sure that we stop this happening. And the thing that the mantra is now that we want any homelessness to be rare, brief and unrepeated. So, if it does happen to you, you know where to go, you get the help you need, you get back on your feet. We know that that's the fundamental purpose of, if you don't have a secure permanent home, you can't do anything else. It becomes the only thing that you're able to concentrate on. So you can't sort out your career or your job or your family because you haven't got anywhere to be, and that's a real problem. So we've done the most amazing thing during the pandemic. I'm absolutely determined that we're going to build on that and not go back to where we were before.
Thank you. Diolch, Julie. I mean, that's all very encouraging and incredibly positive, but this is one for all three of you, I guess. We're entering very difficult times, aren't we? Never mind how we come out of lockdown, but we know that the economy will be taking a big hit. We know that a lot of our third sector organisations will be decimated by the trouble they've had to keep going over the past months. So, what kind of reassurances can you give to the LGBT plus community that the organisations that have supported them and the community spaces and so on will still be there to give them that kind of infrastructural support in the coming months and years? Does somebody want to lead on that?
If I make a start, perhaps.
Yes, difficult to know which one of us is going to speak, isn't it?
Well, I think one of the important things has been that, in different ways, and obviously Julie has put that fantastically important money into tackling and preventing homelessness, and it's actually changed policy, which is really an attitude, which is really important. But we have had, we've all been involved in thinking about recovery plans as well, because we know the impact in the coming weeks and months or we're already seeing it in terms of loss of jobs and rising unemployment. So one of the things that I insisted on, in which we had to sort of fight for what we were going to get into, not fight, but make the case for what we must protect, because so much money has had to be repurposed into dealing with COVID-19 and important ways like with Julie's money, also much for Kirsty as well. But I think things like the socio-economic duty, which we're going to enact from the Equality Act, will be very important, because all public bodies will have to think within their resources and policy responsibilities about the impact socially and economically of their policies on people, because we've got to recognise, as well as from an equalities front, yes, we can continue. We've got to position the Transgender Action Plan. We've got to safeguard the funding for Stonewall Cymru, which we are doing into next year, into the various ways in which, for example, Kirsty and I were sort of jointly doing a lot of work on Show Racism the Red Card, for example, another strong diversity issue. And of course, in terms of intersectionality, there's a lot of work that we're doing with the Black, Asian, minority, ethnic communities as well as the impact on gender. But all this is intersectional as well with LGBT plus people in Wales. So I think our recovery plans, which people have contributed to coming forward and leading in, which will be into people's manifestos and into the election next May, will be very important. We have all spent time, each one of us and all ministers, actually probably speaking and working with those who've got lived experience and who are actually at the front and the sharp end, probably more than we've done in previous times. We just relentlessly met and talked and listened and then made our case for, moving forward in a particular way. And we're very fortunate that actually we've been able to work together so cohesively with people who are not just in government, but who are actually in the third sector, in the statutory sector, at the forefront, like Kirsty has with education. So, I mean, these next few weeks and months are as critically important to us as we ease out of lockdown as they have been over the last few weeks and months.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in on that? Is there anything that you can tell us, particularly around the mental health issue, which I think is really significant, isn't it? That we know that those kind of services are at risk, and we know that a lot of them are delivered in a voluntary capacity. So how do we ensure that the LGBT community will still have that infrastructure of support after this?
I think from a young person's point of view, we're very aware about the impact of lockdown on all children and young people's mental health at this time, and ensuring that we have been able to put some additional financial resource into counselling services. And obviously counselling services are operating in a different way now because of COVID, but trying to get ahead of the curve, and also looking at some of the issues for younger children where traditional counselling methods aren't appropriate. Counselling suggests that you have some control over your reaction and your situation, and you can do something different, and that's not necessarily the case if you're a very small child. I think what's also really important is, despite the challenges, we need to look to the youth services as well, recognising that for many young people, their trusted adult is a youth worker, whether that be in a traditional council-run service or in a voluntary-led service. So ensuring that we're able to maintain support and grow support for the youth service within Wales, both, as I said, statutory and in the voluntary sector, I think is going to be really, really important, because often, as I said, children, if they're experiencing problems or have questions and want to have that safe space to explore and talk about issues around gender, relationships, how they're navigating the world, we should never forget the importance of the youth worker as well as the teacher. And some of the work has been disrupted because of COVID, but we really are looking to really support the youth sector, professionalise it, and give those individuals involved in delivering youth services, the skills, because we can have the ambition of the bill, can't we, and the ambition of the legislation, but that needs to translate into something really real and tangible for children and young people, whether that be in school or in the youth service. And again, when we talk about the education family, sometimes I'm criticised by purists about this. I just think we can never ignore the youth service and the contribution that they can bring into schools, because sometimes they will be the most appropriate person to be delivering parts of the curriculum, not just necessarily a teacher, especially when we look at the skills balance and the skills mix that those professionals have. But that's been really important for me, is to be able to maintain the levels of funding at this time to the youth service.
Okay, thanks. Julie?
And then I suppose, the other thing, and it sounds fundamentally dull, I'm afraid, but it absolutely matters, is that we've managed to maintain the funding for local authorities in Wales in a way that just hasn't been possible across the border. And what that means is that they don't pull their horns in and stop funding a lot of the groups that are very necessary locally. So it's a little bit like a domino thing, isn't it? You know, once you've pushed the first domino over, the whole lot go over, you know. And what we've done is we've very much tried to maintain that first domino in an upright position, to push the analogy a bit too far probably, because we've been trying to make sure that local authorities don't have sudden drops, you know, because of loss of income or other things that they were reliant on. We've been able to replace a lot of that for them. And the result of that is that they've been able to work properly with their local communities to make sure that a lot of the organisations people rely on are able to continue. Now, that hasn't been at 100%. That's for sure, and I know that they are struggling, but we have been really emphasising, you know, look at what your pattern of provision locally looks like and make sure that you have a mixed pattern of provision that will still be there at the end of the crisis, so that we don't have, you know, big gaps in service provision that have been put in place by voluntary third sector organisations for years and years and years that suddenly disappear because that tiny little bit of core funding that they absolutely depended on, you know, for that poor person who was probably paid for 4 hours and does 12 or 15 or 16 or 48 or whatever it is that people do above and beyond. But that core funding, which might look tiny to us, is absolutely fundamental to the way that organisation is able to carry on. So we've done that a bit direct through one of Jane's funds, so people can directly do that. But we've also done it by making sure that the local authority itself is not so in dire straits that it starts to pull all of its funding back in. And we've been working hard with them all the way through the through the crisis, really, to try and make sure that happens. And I hope this isn't in too much of an overshare, but I've spent more time with local authority leaders over the crisis than I have with my own family. One of the both benefits and disbenefits of all of this is this kind of forum, isn't it? So yeah, sure. I'm not sure if I could have got to an actual conference today for 2.5 hours because I've got a very busy day, but I absolutely could come to something straight up like this. We did a great housing one in very short period of time. Laura, you've come to a few things that I know you wouldn't have been able to come to, but you were able to do it from home, so you could get to more things. So, you know, there have been some good things about that. And that's meant that we've melded together in a kind of Team Wales approach that perhaps we wouldn't have done before because we've got just more familiar with each other. We've spent more time together. People have been able to share ideas in a way that perhaps wasn't possible when we all had to drive to some mutually inconvenient place, as is the saying here in Wales. You know, and actually that's been that we shouldn't underestimate the benefit that that's had. So I'm sure that for the LGBT community, they too have formed, you know, new cohorts of friendship groups and so on as a result of this new way of doing things that I would very much want to see carried on and supported into the future, because actually, you know, that has been one of the small upsides of this whole crisis. So I think there's something there. And the last thing I wanted to say was, you know, we do talk a lot, quite rightly, about, you know, the situation of young people who are struggling with their identity perhaps for the first time and so on. But we mustn't forget either that this is an issue for some people all the way through their lives, and that we now have a cohort of people the same age as me, you know, who were illegal when they were young and you know, formed, you know, real lasting traumas in some case from their experience of being illegal when they were young, who are now going into older age and who may need support. And we need to make sure that those support services are fit for purpose, and that we don't inadvertently set up expectations of the way people behave in older age that just don't suit everybody's, you know, everybody else's complex kind of life circumstances. So just making sure that the kind of lessons of the curriculum get spread out past there into lifelong learning, you know, University of the Third Age, all of those other kinds of things. So making sure that we're actually carrying that message out into the wider community. You know, when Leslie meets with the farming unions, making sure that we are discussing some of the issues that come up in rural communities, because we know that can be a real issue in Wales. You know, not everybody's experience is terrific. if they're a bit unusual in a farming community, and that could be unusual in any sense, couldn't it?
Yeah.
So we just need to be, we need to stay cognizant of that and make sure that we pull people together and keep them understanding that that's the way we are in Wales, that we're an open, inclusive, welcoming society, and that's what we expect from them.
Well, that's a really good point at which to bring things to a close. I think we've run out of time, but I want to say a really big diolch yn fawr to you all. I know you've given up a lot of your precious time to come and engage with us on some really important agendas for the LGBT plus community. We talked about housing, we talked about local government, we talked about education and the curriculum, we talked about the whole GRA and equality agenda. But I think the fact that the Welsh Government prioritises this is a great source of comfort for everyone in Wales who identifies in these ways, because it gives us some faith that these issues will get a proper hearing and there won't be the kind of discrimination and ignorance that happens elsewhere. So I think we can say thank you to all of you for the work that you've done on these agendas, but also a big ask, which is to continue doing the work and don't let it fall by the wayside or get deprioritized, because these things are very, very important for the next generation as much as they are for the generations to which we all belong. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure, and please keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Nice to be here. Bye, Laura.
Great.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.